Okay, folks, let's start today's wellness talk. I'm Sharon Meyer. I'm the integrative functional medicine nutrition at the Institute for Health and Healing. And the Institute is part of Sutter's integrative program. So today we're going to talk about salt. So we have an ocean within us. We cry salt, we sweat salt, and the cells in our bodies are bathed in salty fluids. And without salt, we would die. So we are essentially really salty. So now about salt. Pure salt consists of the elements sodium and chlorine. Its chemical name is sodium chloride. And its formula, for those of you that are very interesting, is capital N, small a, capital C, and I. That is what we call salt, chemically speaking. And for those that have just joined us, I just want to tell you that we have an ocean within us, and we are really essentially salty. So as you know, I like the history of things. How did this become what it is? Where did things start? And so the history of salt is long and very colorful. So prior to industrialization, it was really expensive and labor-intensive to harvest mass quantities of salt that was necessary for food preservation, and seasoning. They didn't have fridges and freezers and all that kind of stuff, so they used salt as a preservation. And this made salt really an extremely valuable commodity. And entire economies were based on salt production and trade. In the Iron Age, the British evaporated salt by boiling seawater or brine from salt springs. And they did this in small clay pots over open fires. In the Roman times, salt making was entailed in boiling the seawater in large lead-lined pans. And salt was used as a currency in ancient Rome. So the roots of the words soldier and salary can be traced to Latin words, which is related to giving or receiving salt. Fascinating, right? During the Middle Ages, salt was transported along roads that were built especially for that purpose. One of the most famous of these roads is the old salt route in northern Germany, which ran from the salt mines to different shipping ports. They had to get it everywhere. So like we have the spice route, we also had the salt route. Salt taxes and monopolies have led to wars and protests everywhere from China to parts of Africa. And the anger over the salt taxes was one of the causes of the French Revolution. So in colonial India, the British government could produce and profit from the salt production conducted by Indians living on the coast. And Gandhi chose to protest this monopoly in March 1930, and he marched for 23 days with his followers. And when he arrived on the coast, Gandhi violated the law by boiling a chunk of salty mud. This march later became known as the Salt March to Dandi, or the Salt Satyagraha March. And people across India began making their own salt in protest, and the march became an important milestone in the struggle for Indian independence. It also, salt that is, played a very significant role in early America. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony held the first patent to produce salt in the colonies and continued to produce it for the next 200 years. The Erie Canal was opened primarily to make salt transportation easier, and during the Civil War, the Union captured significant Confederate salt works and created a temporary salt shortage in the Confederate States. And it still continues to be an importance to the economies of many of the states, including Ohio, Louisiana, and Texas. So fascinating. And really, if you want to look at the history of that, there's a book just called Salt. And it's really amazing. I love this stuff. Salt was also used for religious purposes. Aside from economics, and also its cultural aspects. Religion played a significant role in the history of salt. It's been used in Shintoism to purify things, and in Buddhists use salt to repel evil. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, salt was used to purify people and objects. It was used as an offering and to seal covenants. And there are numerous references to salt in the Old and New Testaments. One of the most famous is Lot's wife, who was turned into a pillar of salt in Genesis after disobeying God's command. And a rock salt pillar that stands today on Mount Saddam is known as Lot's wife. So, again, fascinating, right? And there are a lot of salt sayings. So, it was often, so one of the sayings that is used is, he's not worth his salt. And it was often traded, salt was often traded for slaves, which was the origin of that expression, not worth his salt. Someone who's the salt of the earth is a dependable, unpretentious person. And salting the earth, on the other hand, refers to an ancient military practice of plowing fields with salt so that no crops could be grown. And there's a whole list of these things. Really, it's amazing. So where does the salt come from? It's mined from all over the world, or it's evaporated from seas, oceans, and salt lake. So table salt is perhaps the most common variety. It's also the most processed. It's mined, or it's either brought up as rock salt or dissolved underground and then evaporated later. And sometimes it's treated with all kinds of things so that you get that granular format of it. So lecithin is definitely one of the things that gets thrown in salt so it doesn't clump. It's also often fortified with iodine, and we need the iodine for thyroid's function. But many food lovers skip the table salt, So we've gotten to that place where we really are using salt that is unrefined. So things like that white taste, where anything that's white has had all the nutrients taken out of it, it's not something that gets used a lot of. And so when we're thinking of salt, we're thinking of where are the minerals with that salt that makes it so very functional for our bodies. So kosher salt is one of the ones that we use, kosher salt or sea salt. Kosher doesn't have any of the additives in it, and its name comes from the fact that it meets all the Jewish dietary guidelines. It's also coarser than table salt. And then there's a variety of sea salt and flavors of salt, which is based on a lot of the salt water. So most grocery store sea salt is evaporated through man-made means. But more of the expensive salts comes from shallow pits or pans of sea salt that have been allowed to evaporate. And those salt crystals are harvested. So the salt from the top of the pan is usually white and neutral in flavor, and this one is known as the fleur de sel, or the flour of the salt. And then salt from the bottom of the pans usually has some color and more nuanced flavor. So that one is known as sal gris, or gray salt. Sea salt that is produced via natural evaporation can have a variety of textures too. So the famous one is the Malden sea salt, which comes from England's east coast. So it's known for its white, flat, fragile, crunchy flake. I always have some of that. If I'm going to put, sometimes I'll put that on top of a dessert. I'm thinking more Thanksgiving here. Then I'll put that on top of a dessert, and that salt and the crunchiness is a very different flavor. Or I might put it on some vegetables, so the crunchiness of that salt is quite yummy. Some of the mined salts can also have different flavors and colors, and it's really based on where it comes from. For example, the Himalayan salt comes from the Kura salt mine in Pakistan, and it's the second largest salt mine in the world and one of the oldest. It's believed that Alexander the Great discovered the Kura mine salts in about 320 BC. And the pink color comes from the traces of the rust in the salt. And we know now that you can get all kinds of different flavored salts. There's Chardonnay flavored or any wine flavored salts. You can buy those now. There are smoked flavored salts. There are different types of salts. And sometimes in my home, I buy some of the bigger grains of salt and then the fine, and I mix them up, and I'll put different herbs in there. I might put a little bit of onion, some powdered onion in there, and maybe some thyme, and maybe some oregano, maybe some Italian spices, and just mix up all the salts. And it's so yummy when you put some of that on food. I'm a big salt person. Love it. So from a culinary point of view, just a small dash of salt can actually take a bland dish and heighten all of its flavors. It makes it taste extraordinary. Salt brings out the flavor. And remember, it's one of the taste buds that we have. Salty, very pronounced on the tongue. And salt knocks out bitterness and makes food taste sweeter, reducing the need for sugar. There's some interesting data about if we become very deficient in salt, we crave more carbohydrates, and it has, and the reason for that is that it is a insulin issue. We'll come back to that. In cooking, salt acts as more than a seasoning. It pulls the flavors together and it accents them. It preserves meat and fish by drawing out the moisture, but it also acts as a tenderizer. And we use salt in things like baking. If you think about any recipe, it always calls for some salt in some of the baking. And it's always used in savory foods. Now we know things like salt and ice cream and chocolate. Salt is in ice cream and chocolate. It's kind of normal, right? But if you think about 10, 15 years ago, adding salt to anything sweet was definitely not the norm. It balances things out. So as much as we relish the satisfaction and the savory heartiness of salt, which we add to food, it plays a really fundamental role in dozens of critical functions in our body. So, in fact, salt is so important to us. It's almost as important as water and air. And within us, we have anywhere from 4 to 8 ounces of salt. Now, how much is that, you wonder? Anyway, I'll tell you how much we need to be having. So medically, salt is needed to maintain the optimal amount of blood in our bodies. It's needed by the heart to pump blood throughout our bodies. It's essential for digestion. We need it for cell-to-cell communication. It regulates our metabolism. We need salt for bone formation and strength. We need it, of course, for preventing dehydration. But it's really critical for reproduction too, so fertility and reproduction. We need it for proper function of cells and also for how our muscles function and work. It's also required for optimal transmission of nerve impulses to and from our organs, such as our heart and our brain. So we pretty much need it. So you may say to me, but what about the warnings about salt, especially with high blood pressure? So it turns out that the percentage of populations worldwide who are salt sensitive is so small, and that all of those other people that aren't salt sensitive have been lumped into the same category of cutting out salt and reducing the salt, and are therefore doing some very serious harm to their bodies. So the latest double-blind randomized study shows that low-salt diets were creating abnormalities that are commonly found in patients with coronary heart disease, as well as metabolic syndrome. It was also found, and so these results was also found in salt-sensitive people and salt-resistant folks. So salt has also been found to have other risk factors, or reducing salt has found to have other risk factors for other diseases too. So how much salt should we actually have? We should have anywhere between 3 to 6 grams per day. And that equates to about a teaspoon, 1 1/3 teaspoons to 2 2/3 of a teaspoon per day. Now, I can tell you I will be up there with the 2 and the 2/3, if not more. To me, salt is such an important part, and I salt my food all the time. It just brings out the flavor. So who should be having salt? Anybody that has a very high sugar diet. Anyone that has any hypothyroid issues should be having more salt in their diet. If you're fatigued, you want to be having more salt. If you're on any antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs, any diabetes medication, all of these will lower your salt levels in the body, so you need to up the sodium. Caffeine, whether it's tea or coffee, will deplete and dehydrate you, so you need more salt. If you're doing a keto diet or a low carb diet, or you're doing intermittent fasting, you need more salt. If you're doing saunas regularly, salt it up. Intense workouts, you need to have more salt. And if you drink lots of water, you need to be adding some salt to your diet. There's a really good book. It's called The Salt Fix. SALT, salt, and fix, FIX, and it's by Dr. James, DINICOLANTONIO. I know, it's a mouthful. D. Nicolantonio. It's a really fascinating book, and it looks at all the data in the last 2 years and all the research about the deficit of salt, and when we've reduced them, what has happened to our health. I highly recommend the book. It's really fascinating. So, folks, any other questions on salt before we say goodbye? Now would be the time to unmute yourself and ask those questions.